Well, good morning, everyone. Good to be with you. So this morning's story, as we've heard a few times, is about a fiery woman. Under the tree sits a woman of fire in spirit and words of command. Under the tree sits a woman who knows that victory belongs to the God of hosts, the God who would use the last and the least, the despised and derided, the women, the prophets. Under the tree sits a woman who speaks to judges and warriors and women in tents. She says, "Oh, blessed are you. Oh, blessed are you, Barak, the lightning who fears. I will go with you, but victory is not yours. Oh, blessed are you, Yael, among those who wait in the tent as the enemy draws near to his death. Blessed are you who command and kill for God under the tree that demands a victim's blood. Blessed are you who do as God says, but at what cost? But at what cost?" This is the question that the book of Judges makes me ask again and again and again and again. The book of Judges and its neighbor, Joshua, contains some very challenging stories for us today. Challenging in that it's hard to find hope and redemption in them, and challenging in that my gut instinct is to reject them, and when prompted by the phrase, "This is the word of the Lord," to cross my fingers behind my back and say, "Really, God? Is this your word?" How do we approach texts like this that are hard to hear and that don't really seem to edify us as a community of faith? Judges and Joshua both detail events in the story of Israel that absolutely should not be in a Sunday school material, let alone a children's Bible. So hello, Book of Belonging. The story is indeed in here. I admire the author's courage to include the judges, and I admire the way she weaves the threads of Deborah's story into the greater one. So as we return to the Book of Belonging for our summer series, interspersed here with other guest speakers this summer, where do we find ourselves in the greater story? Well, the people God goes with, the Israelites, have settled in the land of Canaan. And depending on which account you read, the people have either or both totally annihilated the inhabitants, or they've subdued them and are living side by side with those who remain. In the Book of Belonging, we read this section on the judges. The people God goes with forgot the way God taught them to live, caring for the forgotten, welcoming others, making sure everyone had enough. They ignored God's names for them and turned to other gods, other pastimes, anything to help them feel safe, loved, belonging, and good. God did send judges to them to bring people back to the path whenever they forgot. And boy, did they ever forget the path to goodness and righteousness. In the stories we heard the formula that describes each section in the book of Judges. So the people turn away, they are oppressed by the enemy, they cry out to God. God hears them and sends a leader, a judge. The people are victorious and they experience peace, only to turn away again and again and invoke that cycle again. The stories of the judges also in the book grow increasingly longer from chapter 1 to chapter 21. They grow longer and worse. They become more and more horrific in their treatment of people, especially women. And the book ends on this gut punch of a line. In those days, there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. And the book's over. So it's quite an indictment at the end of this book. So in my first semester of my undergrad degree at Bible College, I took my first biblical studies course called Joshua and Judges. And it's been interesting to go back. I dug through my boxes of stuff, and I have kept all my notes from many, many years. And it's been interesting to look at those notes and most importantly, see how much my theology has changed. Some of the theology contained in those handwritten notes is theology I no longer agree with. One of the things is that throughout my notes on these two books of the Bible was a constant refrain of, well, it's recorded in the Bible, so it must be God's will. The stories are bad, a little bad, a lot bad, yes, but maybe it was necessary for God to show his power. But, on the other hand, it's a display of God's sovereign love. Judgment on the Canaanites, the pagans, and by extension, the Israelites who flirted with these people was just tough love in the most divine of forms. Remember, this is a class on 2 books about conquest and what today we would call genocide. Now, I'm sure my memory on this class is a bit fuzzy, but I'm sure we discussed how awful some of these texts are, and we lamented that some of them are included in our most sacred of texts. But what I read in my notes and what I do remember, it seems there was little room for other interpretations or the contributions of other disciplines for that matter, like archaeology and historical criticism. And I can guarantee that feminist theology or queer theology didn't even make it into a footnote in the class lectures. But that's okay. Those things came later in life for me as I continued to study the scriptures. But in my notes, when I got to Judges 4 and 5, there were a few words on Deborah, this character in chapter 4 and chapter 5. And it was interesting to note that the most important thing, you don't have to read those words on there, if you can see them, great. But I noted a few times that Deborah was, capital N-O-T, not a judge. She was a prophet by all means, but she was definitely not judging. So I just found that interesting. I noted that twice in my notes at the beginning when we first covered Deborah, and then later in my summary. She judged. She was more of a prophet than a judge. And I found that interesting. Maybe this was because Deborah was not mentioned in later recollections of the judges in books like 1 Samuel and much later in the New Testament in the book of Hebrews. Deborah's not included in these lists of Israel's judges, but Barak is listed, people like Gideon, Yiftach, men who are remembered for their fears and failures and terrible vows as much as their victories. Deborah's not in those lists. But she is one of the judges in this book with the least amount of problems. The people succeed because of her faithfulness and connection to the Spirit of God. She is the legend that is remembered, however sparse the textual memories of her are. So what can we learn from Deborah's example? Is there anything we can redeem from this book of so many horrors? Well, with the Book of Belonging as our guide, there are 2 portraits of Deborah that illustrate helpful characteristics and 2 values that I believe are at the heart of the people God goes with. So first is that Deborah is a leader. She is a spirit-filled prophet and judge, raised up to lead her people. In the text, Deborah enters with a dynamic introduction, and this fire imagery that you'll see a lot today comes from her name and the translation of her name. But in the text, it begins, and Deborah, she is a woman, a prophet woman, a woman of flames, she who is judging Israel at that time. There's repetition, and it's kind of pounding into us this introduction of this dynamic and fiery woman right at the beginning. The text also implies that she's been in this role even before Israel fell into a new cycle of idolatry and oppression. She has been a glowing, fiery presence that people look to for guidance and hope during times of peace and times of war. Deborah hears the voice of God, and she appoints others for the tasks that God sets before them. She is a leader to the leaders, arising as a mother in Israel, as we read in Judges 5:7. Her story makes me think of Jesus' words in the Gospel from 2 books, that wisdom will be vindicated or known by her children, or known by her works. In Luke and Matthew, these words are kind of interchangeable. So as it were, Deborah's children are her deeds, her works, and she is a legend because of her role in the community and because of their collective accomplishments. Deborah sings a victory song in Judges 5, which we heard a bit of earlier, a chapter which is a poetic and embellished version of the preceding chapter 4. It's the longest prophetic declaration of any prophesying woman in the Bible. In it, Deborah praises the deeds of God, the tribes of Israel, Barak, Yael, and she also utters curses against the enemy. So Deborah blesses and she curses, bringing the full weight of God's mercy and judgment down on listeners and readers. So second, Deborah, the faithful leader, the prophet, judge, promises the fearful one, Barak, that she will go with him into battle. She promises companionship in a time of need. At the beginning of the story that we heard, after a direct description of what God will do for them, Barak says, well, if you will go with me, I will go. But if you will not go with me, I will not go. Does Barak recognize that Deborah is God's chosen messenger and the fiery force that he needs for victory? Why does he hesitate? Well, in her commentary on this book, Dr. Wilda Gaffney makes the point that Barak is Deborah's second in command. He is accountable to her. So she sees that as a bit of defiance, actually. But Gaffney writes, the scriptures seem to accept his insubordination and cowardice as evidence of his dependence on the unseen God, whom he associates so much with Deborah that to be separate from one is to be separate from the other. So Barak recognizes who this fiery woman is and her connection with God. So whatever Barak's reasons for hesitation and insistence on Deborah's coming with him, Deborah says, I will surely go with you, with the note that now victory will not be wrought by your hands, but by the hands of a woman. Later, as they approach the enemy, she encourages Barak with a battle cry. She says, up, arise, for this is the day on which the Lord has given Sisera, the commander, into your hand. The Lord is indeed going out before you. Deborah accompanies this fearful leader into battle and prods him on and encourages him in a time of need. So these are two hopeful portraits of Deborah as a leader and as a companion. So there are two questions or two invitations I see for us here. The first question is, can we be filled with the Spirit and open to the voice of God? Can we be like Deborah in this case? She is one whose life is marked by this glowing flame of God's Spirit, embodying a space where she listens and leads, prophesies and blesses. I see her sitting under that tree day after day, a place where people come with the assurance that they will see or hear from God. What a gift to those around her. So even if we are not prophets or preachers or warriors, we bear the image of God and embody that Spirit that gives life to all. So how does God speak into your life? And how do you speak that life and that fire into those around you? A second question or invitation is, can we accompany one another? Can we promise one another companionship and provoke one another onwards to fulfill the tasks at hand? Like Deborah going with Barak on the journey and making sure he moves from the edge of the battlefield into the fray. And in case I'm switching too much between literal and metaphorical language, I should be clear that this invitation is for us in our metaphorical battles. I don't need to tell a group of Mennonites that, but there you go, just in case anyone's confused. Life is hard some days. It might feel like a battle. Like Deborah as a mother in Israel, so many of you arise and get up to the daily task of caring for those around you and carrying the weight of many things. There is much to carry today. For all of us, the load is heavy. Do we have the humility and courage to bring our friends and community along with us? Do we have the courage to say, yes, I will go do this, but only if you come with me? Now, I can only speak for myself, but I imagine I'm not the only one who feels like Barak more days than I feel like Deborah. Can we accompany one another? Now, to round out this portrait, this picture, I add a third portrait. And it's one that goes beyond the scope of Deborah, and it's why I included the reading of Judges to get a better sense of this book as a whole. This portrait characterizes several others in the book, and it's a common thread that runs through, and it is the use of trickery or cunning to achieve goals. And as we know, and we've already heard stories from this book of belonging, this goes beyond the book of Judges as well. Again, as far as we know, Deborah doesn't do anything untoward. She, besides leading Israel into destructive battles. But text doesn't tell us that she lies or cheats, and she doesn't use suggestive or misleading language, like the judge who precedes her, Ehud. Some of you might know this story too. When Ehud is alone with the enemy king Eglon, Ehud says, "I have a message from God for you." King listens, is interested, and then Ehud stabs him in the belly, and it goes from there. Not the message he was hoping for. But Ehud's the good guy, right? So this is okay, right? Well, closer to our story, Yael, who is not a judge, provides safety for the fleeing commander of the enemy, Sisera, only to present a similar message, which involves a gruesome stabbing as well. But as the text tells us, she is the most blessed of women, most blessed of tent dwellers, and she achieves the Lord's purposes by trickery as well. So there are more and more examples to draw from the book of Judges and the rest of the Bible, and clearly deception is praised. It's a good thing because it brings Israel closer to victory in the land promised to them. But at the end of the day, remember that phrase at the end of the book, all the people did what was right in their own eyes, judges included, and they were not better off for it. So are these people exemplars for us to follow? Were they really following the directives from a good God who is loving and just? I struggle to say yes. Back to my class notes, there is a heading called Applications from Judges. So what does this mean for us today? And there are different links, as they were called. I didn't include a photo of that, but those links are there to help us understand why these texts are meaningful. There were people links, which meant how are we to follow or not follow these examples. And I'm happy to report that there's a big X next to the people links. So at least we acknowledge that we can say, no, this is not a good example to follow. But in the same spot, there's the theological link. And it reads this: God is like this in the book, and I assume this is leading Israel through cycles of punishment and redemption. God is like this in the book, and since God doesn't change, God is like this today. Now, what do I think of that? I find that one difficult. I believe God does not change, but I am wholly convicted that our understanding of God changes, and am I glad it does. There are some beautiful images of God across the ancient scriptures, but the warring and dominant God of the conquest is not one of them. The God who requires our trickery and deceit is not one I want to follow, nor is the God who requires wholesale destruction of those we consider other, or requires a coerced cohabitation in which we, the people God goes with, remain on top and in charge. So I find these texts alarmingly relevant today. There's so much fear in those we consider the other, and conquest still takes form today. Some groups in society feel the need to preserve themselves, their civilization, their culture, or way of being, for fear of being lost. It echoes the sentiments across the stories of ancient Israel, when their identity and even proximity to God was contingent on their place in the world. A lot was at stake, so it's no wonder that they saw God this way. And this story has continued for centuries. God is claimed as all-powerful and the only one, yet this God needs to be defended. This version of God requires suffering and testing to prove faith, so the dominant culture claims any discomfort, inconvenience, as persecution and loss of identity. But all that does is become justification for conquest and making life miserable for others. And this is all done under the sneaky guise of religious freedom. But it's not deception. It's deception that is no longer hidden. It is undisguised, uncovered, a public mockery of the way of Jesus. But doesn't God call us to a different way of being? So the third and final question is this: can we use our cunning for good? And if cunning is too negative of a word, can we use our cleverness, our minds, our imagination? Can we find another way, a way of pursuing God's purposes in the world that does not lead to death and destruction? Can we live as fiery people, glowing with the embers of righteousness and justice deep within, refining ourselves and our world to look more like the divine, or to look more like Jesus, the divine enfleshed among us? Using our prophetic imagination, what would it look like to accompany one another in this pursuit? What would it look like to walk with both victim and oppressor, seeking both their good, calling the oppressor to repent, to turn around and see the image of the Creator in everything they've hurt? We are all invited to see God in everyone we meet, and we must pursue the good and the beautiful together. And may we use our divine imagination to these ends. And speaking of divine imagination, I want to include or share a story this week that I've been meditating on, and it's of courageous acts of nonviolent resistance in the face of such death and destruction. I first heard this story from Andy, and he's heard it in several places, and you can ask him for similar examples too, as something he thinks about a lot. But this is a story about women rising up and leading nonviolent resistance movements in Liberia. Maybe some of you know these stories. During the Second Civil War, which ran from 1999 to 2003, a young mother and social worker named Lima Bowie mobilized women from across the Christian church in her country to pray and gather for peace. They were joined by Muslim women in the cause, and eventually thousands of women were coming together in this endeavor. They gathered daily in the fish market near where the president, Charles Taylor, would see them and hear them. They gathered daily, wearing all white, and they prayed and they danced, calling for the warring parties, so you had the government on one side and the warlords on the other, calling them to come together for dialogue. At this time, these women also committed to a sex strike, withholding intimacy from their partners during this time until the war was over. So that in turn moved their partners to pray for peace and an end to the war as well. Finally, after a long time, negotiations started taking place in Ghana, with outside mediators coming in, but war erupted again at home. So the women continued their vigil and their protest at the fish market amid missiles and dangerous situations and circumstances. But in Ghana, where the negotiations were taking place, a couple hundred of the women were present outside the peace talks, including the leader, Bowie. And their new tactic at this time was to link arms and barricade themselves outside the doors so that the men could not leave until peace was reached, until a peace deal was reached. When approached by police who tried to arrest them, the leader, Bowie, threatened to remove all of her clothing. I don't know if she actually did that or not. I don't know that part of the story. But in this instance, for a woman, for a mother, to strip naked would shame the men deeply and shame herself. But this threat was also a move towards reclaiming her power, the power that was stripped from her and all women throughout the Civil War, taken through years of torture and rape and murder. So eventually, a few weeks later, a peace deal was reached, and later in 2011, Bowie would be awarded a Nobel Peace Prize for her leadership in this movement. So there are books, there's a documentary on her story as well, and it's quite a fascinating story. So talk about a fiery woman. Her prophetic voice and actions mobilized women and others from groups across Liberia, across boundaries like religion, and changed the course of history. And her example serves as a primer for other peace movements around the globe. So this is the gospel of peace in real time, lived out and preached to witnesses across time and space. And this is a movement I want to be part of, don't you? This is a kind of imagination I want to have, don't you? So will we follow this prophetic spirit today? May we do so, and may it be so.